Hey, and how you doing, folks? Yours truly, Randy Rand here. And I want to tell you about a book that I recently read. It's entitled The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. And it was written by Mehrsa Baradaran. In this book, she talks about a lot of things and talks about the function of black banks and the purpose that they serve. She covers a lot of material, and one thing that I found interesting that she was talking about was racism, ghettos, and how ghettos were started. She talks about how ghettos were started and where ghettos were started, and surprisingly enough, as per what she wrote in her book, she mentions that ghettos were started in the North, not the South. She states, in virtually every aspect of Northern life, blacks were segregated from whites. Jim Crow laws mandating segregation in practically all spheres of life began in the North and West, well before the Civil War. This is on page 11. And one thing that I like about the book, she takes her time and breaks down the point that she's made. In other words, she starts off talking about racism, how the ghettos were started in the North, and how the North really wasn't, how the North really missed out on being culpable in the racism thing, as far as receiving blame and so forth and so on. And again, she mentioned the ghettos and how the ghettos were started and how they started in the North. She goes on to say, the ghetto was created by white racism, which in turn generated a complex web of interrelated social, political, and economic challenges. Blacks were forced into a parallel and inferior economy simply because whites in the North would not accept them as neighbors. This was found on page 70. She talks about racism and in a broader sense. How she speaks about how racism is always thought of, with the Klansmen in their white hoods, as opposed to the broader sense of racism. She states, American racism was mistakenly seen as an issue of bigoted white hooded Klansmen, but that was just the ugliest symptom of a broader problem, the visible tumor of a cancer that went far deeper. The segregated practices in the South are a kind of public butchery. It's visible. There's bleeding all over the place. Up here, in the North, we use a stiletto. It's internal bleeding. It's not visible, but it's just as deadly. And this is found on page 136. Again, as I mentioned before, she does a very good job of establishing racism, how it was practiced in the North as well as the South, of course. But she establishes racism first in the book, and she gives a very good history of racism as we know it. And she makes a very good transition from speaking about racism and into black banks and the purpose that they serve. She goes on to speak about the difficulty of these black banks having to survive in the economic conditions that they're facing, being that they're serving a community of people that really don't have a lot of money to begin with. And as it turns out, these banks are pretty much in the same condition as the community they serve. She goes on to state, the clear message that emerges from the history of black banks is that relying on these banks to do the work of achieving wealth equality without changing the economic environment in which they operate is unfair, cynical, and fruitless. Insofar as there is segregation and widespread poverty in the black community, banks that exclusively serve this community cannot be successful. Page 278. Then she moves on to give her opinion about what needs to be done in order to bring more of an equality, financial equality, to these black banks as well as to the communities they serve. She states, if policymakers are committed to closing the wealth gap, black bankers must be seated at the head of the table. Black bankers have a first-hand understanding of the headwinds affecting black prosperity. While black banks cannot close the wealth gap alone, their specialized focus and expertise must play a role in any plan to address this problem. And this is found on page 279. So she's suggesting that policymakers get involved, as I would agree, because they can come up with different policy solutions. And, I don't think it's enough to say that they need to come up with policy solutions. They need to enforce those policy solutions. They have to make it work. In other words, if they're going to create the policy, do it. Make sure the policy is followed. And if it's not followed, well, then there are repercussions that may follow. And finally, in conclusion, she offers a solution that I think is long overdue in this country. She states, there are many policy designs worth considering. A reparations program could take many forms, from simple cash payments or baby bonds to more complex schemes such as subsidized college tuition, basic income, housing vouchers, or subsidized mortgage credit. Nonprofits, academics, and policymakers should be encouraged to propose creative proposals that garner full and meaningful financial inclusion, that reverse the effects of historical exclusions of historic exclusions from wealth creation. And this is found on page 282. Continuing on with her solution to the problem, she states, an essential first step in dealing with the wealth gap is to acknowledge that it was created through racist public policy. Blacks have been harmed in direct contradiction to the Constitution's promise of equal treatment, yet they still have to contend with its requirement for equal treatment in seeking a remedy. It is indeed time for a new social contract with black Americans that deals honestly with the past breach. This is found on page 281. So she speaks about how racist policies that have been created, years ago, is pretty much a problem, and pretty much the problem. And that is certainly not the first time that I have heard the notion that public policy is probably the biggest reason why black Americans are so far behind today.